What up, y'all? So a lot of people have been asking me how to get their music on my brand Vile Hip Hop News. I think I got away. I'm going to start doing music video reactions for independent artists. If you're interested, email me at dlsmediainc1@gmail.com for details. Want a live interview with Viral Hip Hop News? Email me, Sam Ant, at dlsmediainc1@gmail.com. Let's go.
Special guest on the day for interview number 8. Judge Joe Brown is in the building. How you doing today, sir?
Good morning. I'm doing all right. How about you?
Doing well, doing well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for coming on, Joe, Judge, for this interview. We're doing it via audio today, people. For those of you who are curious, we're doing it via audio today, but we got the good judge on. And there's a lot going on in the world. We want to talk to you about the election and things going on with that, but before we do, a couple days ago, we were hit with a bombshell that Diddy was arrested in New York by federal authorities. He is still currently behind bars facing charges on trafficking, sexual assault, and a litany of other charges. In your expert opinion, what do you think about that situation, and what do you think the end result is going to turn out to be when it comes to Sean Combs as we stand right now?
Well, let's say this. Let's separate what's going on from Mr. Combs, P. Diddy. You've all heard of Miranda rights. You have a right to remain silent, anything you say, etc., etc. Miranda was not a nice guy, but these rights that everybody has a vested interest in protecting were enumerated and articulated through Miranda. Now, what I'm talking about is separate and apart from P. Diddy. Over the last 50 years, I've done a lot of trial work. I was a criminal defense lawyer, and starting more than 40 some years ago, I started getting clients who had federal cases, and we'd have to go to trial with the feds. I represented a lot of pimps and prostitutes 40 some years ago. And there's West Memphis, Arkansas, really close to Memphis, Tennessee, right across the bridge. And down here in Mississippi, there's what's been glamorized as P Valley in the series. And I would have pimps transporting dancers and prostitutes across the state lines. So we'd get not RICO, but Mann Act charges against them. The Mann Act was designed to catch Jack Johnson, a black heavyweight champion of the world before World War I that could not be defeated by any great white hope. Jack Johnson had a white wife, and she had some friend girls that would travel around with her, and particularly in the South, a lot of white people found that very offensive. So they set up the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, to develop a proposed law that became known as the Mann Act, and that was designed to get Jack Johnson. Now understand, this was this man's lawful wife, but he was riding on a train across a corner of Georgia, let's say, on the way to a seaport and on the way to Europe. And because they weren't armed at the time, the FBI was accompanied by local law enforcement officers. And in Georgia, let's just say that 100 some years ago, they did not recognize interracial marriage. So Jack Johnson was arrested for transporting a woman, his wife, across interstate lines for illicit purposes. So there is no money necessity involved in this, but it is known as the Mann Act. I'm looking at the 14-page indictment right now, and it doesn't say Mann Act anywhere in there, where usually it would. It mentions the federal code section. I'm looking at the rest of the 14 pages, and I find it absolutely extraordinary because there are only 3 counts to this indictment. And ordinarily, in my experience, an indictment like this would read, between the dates of 2009 up until the return of the indictment, the defendant did unlawfully transport females across state lines for illicit purposes, and they leave it at that. You would be guessing what they were talking about. You'd have to file motions to get a more particular statement, and the feds would fight like hell to keep you from finding out the details so they could try you by ambush. For these 3 counts in the indictment, they went over and over a lot of things. Like, for example, each particular phase of this thing, they keep repeating all of the defendant's aliases. Their standard procedure is in the very first paragraph. The defendant, in this case, and they list his aliases hereinafter known as the defendant, referred to as the defendant, and they would just say defendant in each count where that was necessary instead of repeating all of this. 2,000 bottles of lubricant oil. What in the devil is that? That has no business in the indictment. You have other things in here. The IV, where the performers were given IV infusions to keep their energy up, I guess, because these things have gone on so long. Now, let's translate what they're talking about. They're talking about an accusation that they never did say, but it's inferred that Diddy was pimping an orgy that lasted a while, and he did this on a routine basis, and there were guests that they referred to in the indictment as numerous witnesses, and these guests were coming to a mansion where there were various sex acts going on in various parts of the mansion for purposes of inspiration. And the guests could join in or be inspired by what they were seeing. They even mentioned in here, which was just the scandalous superfluous in this indictment, that Diddy was masturbating during the course of some of these proceedings, which would that's surplus language. That's just trying to inflame. They referred to this thing where we saw on video him running out of a hotel room with a towel without giving any of the background behind it and assaulting this woman. And they referred to it, and that's for inflammatory purposes because that's just part of the pimp game. By the way, anybody's talking about, yeah, man, it's about pimping, man, you know. That's what it's about. It's a filthy game. I represented enough pimps to know what the game is. It's been a long time ago, but it's been the same since time immemorial. They do call prostitution the world's second oldest profession, and whatever the first oldest one was, whoever was doing whatever that was to earn the money to pay for the services of the second oldest profession. So it's been going on for a long time. It's nothing new. And what I'm picking up on is that Diddy is being alleged to have conducted these sex shows, and he invited guests who had the use of his mansions to be involved in an orgy as they saw fit. He also is alleged to have recorded this, and that's where we get to what we're looking at. Somebody important is being or was recorded on these devices, and somebody is being protected. Now, I noticed that Diddy, through his lawyer, has been in continuous contact with the feds for quite a few months. Back in March, he surrendered his passport. He returned to New York, where he did not live, and secured a residence so he could participate in the defense of the case, which is all that's required. He was supposed to have been apprised of when the indictment would be unsealed, and he would be required to report with his lawyer and surrender himself after making bond arrangements. And there was supposed to have been a discussion on how much the feds were going to recommend the bond be set at. They ambushed him and arrested him in a shopping center with some of his kinfolk. And now they want him kept incognito. Not incognito, incommunicado, so he cannot talk to anyone. That's what the feds have been doing, and most recently involving these mortgage fraud situations, so that parties who could blow the whistle on other parties were not able to communicate with anyone, even their lawyers, but say once a week. So they could not tell what they knew, and that's what we have here. It is unusual for Homeland Security to be involved in these things, and there are some references in here that the offenses had an international impact, which brings in Homeland Security instead of leaving this up to the FBI, which is for domestic matters, ordinarily of these nature, of this type of thing. And remember, the FBI was set up to go get Jack Johnson so they could set up and prosecute under what became the Mann Act. So this is the FBI's bailiwick. They were only present during the service of the search warrants. They weren't the primary parties. What that indicates to me, in my experience, is that somebody in the FBI was not deemed trustworthy and might give confidential information to somebody outside, which they didn't want, so they brought in Homeland Security. This is not ordinarily the type of thing that Homeland Security deals with. So you'll notice, too, that two of his mansions were searched. One was in California, fine. One was in Florida. The peculiar thing about the one in Florida is that on the same lot, Diddy had a second mansion, which was not searched. And what they seem to have gotten is a lot of recordings that they confiscated. Now, you might say that's evidence in the case, but the point of the exercise is that even though quite a few people are mentioned indirectly, only one person got indicted. In the federal practices, usually when you have months to investigate something, they indict everybody and they mention everybody, even if they are listed as an unindicted co-actor. They did not do that in this case, which is indicative of them trying to hide somebody's identity and protect some people. The other point is from what you can determine, most of this happened in Florida or California. Why no indictments returned there, and why did they pick New York? What they seem to have done is, considering the totality of the circumstances and the U.S. attorney involved, is they picked New York because it was particularly hostile to Donald Trump and particularly favorable to protecting anybody who is against Trump. So we're kind of put on clue as to who the rest of these unmentioned witnesses, meaning attendees at these events, happen to be. The other point I find interesting is they made a big to-do during the bond review situation that they had yesterday with the fact that he had 3 disassembled carbines and some loaded magazines. Now, everybody and his mama has stuff like that in Florida since it's a constitutional carry and gun-friendly state. In New York, there are a bunch of little freaks who get, oh my God, he's got a gun. And even though there were some federal crimes involved with altered serial numbers on the 3 receiver groups, which is against the law. I think they picked New York so they could use the fact that he had 3 weapons, which, hell, everybody on my block has got 10 times more than that. And as something condemning and touching on or giving semblance to some justification for not setting a bond or even allowing a bond. Now, they're going to go in front of a federal court today, I imagine, and if not, they'll probably go trot down to D.C., which is not that far from New York, and seek one of the appellate judges on the Second Circuit Court of Appeals to set a bond. They can pick anyone they want. The government can come back and demand a bigger hearing, and they'd probably have a 3-member panel that would be selected at random. But in any event, something stinks to high heavens with this whole case. Now, with that said, I'll pass the mic.
Yeah, no, that's some great information. Over the last few months, people have kind of been leaving little comments and saying little things, like that. The next thing I'll ask you is, what do you see being the outcome of this case? And it looks like Diddy's going to be the fall guy. Do you see him getting bond, and do you see him being convicted?
Well, if they can prove the allegations, remember there are only 3 counts. And basically what they're accusing him of is pimping and procuring. And one count that deals with the after effects of doing what pimps do to ply their business, and an inference that somehow or another this is organized crime, which is not the intent of RICO. By the way, they don't use the word RICO in the indictment, which ordinarily they would. And RICO is 54 years old. It was passed in 1970, and it was to deal with John Gotti type situation, gangsters, drug cartels, and that kind of situations. You see it being used or bastardized in Georgia to go after a teachers group, former president of the United States for engaging in political activity, and for proceeding against a rap group for having some disagreeable lyrics. So it's being corrupted. It's racketeering influenced, organized crime is what the thing stands for. RICO. Racketeering or influenced criminal organizations. And they are pushing it for political purposes. And the last time they did this was about 10, 11 years ago, when they had a series of prosecutions that were initiated on state levels for mortgage fraud, mortgage foreclosure fraud. You got some people who had something that would have contributed evidence-wise in sustaining these allegations of foreclosure fraud. They got locked up and charged peripherally for remotely associated things. And interestingly, what the feds did is they used Homeland Security to get them locked incommunicado so they couldn't communicate with anybody. And particularly, the governor in Maryland got implicated in one of these scams, and his niece, who was a federal prosecutor, busted somebody that could have blown the whistle on him. And that person got held incommunicado. Then there was, of course, the thing with the presidential candidate, Kamala Harris, out on the West Coast with George Soros, who was also hooked up with the Maryland thing, and One West Bank, along with Mnuchin, who was the CEO for that bank, and became part of the Obama administration, and for a year, the Trump administration, for that matter. But people were locked up and held incommunicado, so they could not do anything about that. But there were 5,200 counts of indictments returned against One West Bank. And they mentioned that Kamala Harris, when she got elected as Attorney General for California, consolidated, dismissed, and then a few weeks later, Soros sold One West Bank for, I think it was $3.42 billion, made a tidy profit off of it. So this is part of a process that got put in place 40 years ago by Eastland from Mississippi, Biden, and Byrd, who had formerly been Grand Dragon for the Klan in the U.S., and they were in the U.S. Senate together, and they added these provisions to U.S. criminal law codes that allowed this kind of persecution for political purposes. So it's nothing new. It's been around for 40-some years. I've defended people who've been caught up in it. That's been a while ago, but it is a bad thing. So this is the same thing that went after R. Kelly about in a couple of his series of cases. His circumstances are somewhat different because that involved underage children. But as I'm reading this indictment, and as I'm talking to you, I'm going back over it again. I don't see any references to underage children in this indictment. Right. So any questions or comments so far?
Yes, sir. And we highlighted some of those exact points yesterday as well, as far as there's no underage. It didn't seem like in the indictment there were any underage involvement, which would obviously be deemed as guilty, and that would be crazy and things like that. What I want to ask you is, it seems as though federal authorities are using the tactic of crushing his character and making him guilty in the public before being guilty in the court of law. Is that a tactic that the feds typically use, and how beneficial is that? And do you think that's going on right now?
You can thank the current president of the United States for that. I just alluded to it. Eastland and Byrd came up 40 years ago with changes in the federal criminal laws that allow that to happen. It's called these days lawfare. That's what they're talking about. Now, Diddy is presumed innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. They have to put the trial on and they have to convict him. But what I'm looking at is an extra effort to totally discredit him. So if he is later in a position of being a whistleblower, his credibility will be completely destroyed, and public opinion can be steered in a direction where basically anything he says can be ignored or discredited. I think that's why it's looking like it does. As I look at it and read the indictments, it's nothing that I haven't run into before, representing a lot of pimps, prostitutes, and dancers. And it's just pimping and procuring. That's what they're talking about. And in this case, the purpose was to set up some freak parties, freak shows, orgies, where performances were being professionally put on in various places in a mansion while the rest of the folk could get their freak on. That's what you're looking at here.
Right. Now there's another aspect of it as well where they are accusing him of forcefully, making men and women do sexual acts that they did not want to do. Okay.
They wouldn't even say that. That's just adding a bit in there to make it look worse. Essentially, there are just 3 counts to this indictment, but instead of 2 pages, it's 14 because they add a lot of little stuff in there to make it look horrible to the typical person that is likely to get this, which most aren't. They just hear the news media talk about it.
Now, it's been a lot of discussion going on, and we can argue to our face turn blue whether or not Diddy is a good man or not. But we're talking about whether or not he has broken the law to the point where he needs to be put behind bars for a number of years, and that's where we're at right now. In your opinion,
That's not the important part of
right?
this. That's well set up, the due process of law in the Bill of Rights and also in the 14th Amendment. He's got the right to due process, whether it's on a state level, which this is, federal level, which comes in under the Bill of Rights. What we're talking is, why is the U.S. government taking it upon itself to do what it's doing, where it becomes very obvious if you read between the lines, they're trying to protect somebody instead of prosecuting them as co-actors in this mess, and why they're trying to do what they're doing to silence somebody who might expose who those protected people are. Keep the Epstein thing in mind. We know who was on the list of visitors to the island and who flew on the airplanes, because those things have been published. But this time, this close to this crucial November election, it strikes me that somebody does not want that to happen again.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but we kind of alluding to maybe former presidents or political people.
No, Trump has nothing to do with this one.
I was talking
This
also
is
about
Trump.
Obama, maybe.
No,
Okay.
this is Mrs. Imhoff is married to a big-time Hollywood lawyer. Prior to 2014, when she married him, this big-time Jewish Hollywood lawyer who has a lot of clients in the communications industry, they were all on Kamala Harris's behind about her little goings on. It stopped suddenly in 2014 when she married somebody who had a Hollywood inside. And you have to understand, who is this that's likely to be going to these parties, and who is it involved? It is an entertainer. Is there some kind of implication that would influence that person's campaign? And we already know what kind of freak she has already been. We look at Willie and Montel, and when she was at Howard, and some other things going on out there in California that are a bit wild. So this, remember, has been going on allegedly since 2009. Who is implicated in this? It's not Trump. This is brought to you by people who are very much against Trump and more likely to protect somebody else. I find it unprecedented that none of these witnesses are listed with the rest of the detail, which is not surprising in a federal case, since they try to obscure their witnesses. See, in a state case, every one of the 50 states, unless the prosecution can show the judge that some witness's life is in danger, they have to give the defense the list of witnesses, their contact information, and not only the ones they know about, the ones that they should have found out about in the exercise of what they call due diligence in an investigation. A state prosecution has to be transparent, but in the feds, they do it by ambush. So I'm particularly concerned about the input of all of these gory details in here, which are designed essentially to inflame the public.
Right. Could we? Yep.
I don't know, because it's going to depend upon the jury. But you see, now you've got a situation where subtly and perhaps allowably they've tainted any New York jury, because they've been showing these film clips.
Yep.
So whatever the jurors told, unless there's an exceptionally able jury selection, you're going to get people in the, yeah, I saw what he did. And you can hear it on some of social media. We had an egg space, Dana and I, the real Dana and I did last night. And there were some people that called and they didn't care what the law was. He needed to go to jail
Right.
because of the horrible things he did. But you see, that's not American law.
Right.
See a lot of that right now.
Yeah.